Good afternoon and welcome to the Lift Off webinar. Thursday afternoon, December 14th. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce our next Lift Off webinar with MTU. My name is Christine Longroy, Senior Director of Ecosystem with Lyft. Again, appreciate everybody being part of this webinar and this very important discussion. So it is my pleasure to introduce Cassie de Munoz, the Executive Director of Enrollment Initiative at MTU. And today she's going to be talking about the Gen Zoom and the state of mind of the post-pandemic youth. As Cassie is presenting, I'd like to remind you to add any questions that you might have during the presentation in the chat function, and we will have time after the presentation to address those questions. We look forward to the great presentation and the discussion that we're going to have today. So again, thank you for joining us.
Welcome to Liftoff Webinars, brought to you by LIFT, the National Advanced Material Manufacturing Innovation Institute, where we drive American manufacturing into the future through technology and talent development. LIFT is a public-private partnership where we convene and connect government, industry, and academia in the fields of advanced materials, manufacturing processes, systems engineering to enhance America's manufacturing competitiveness, national economy, and national security.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining in this session. This might be a topic that is totally new and foreign to you and maybe one you've not thought a lot about. But my name is Cassie Taft de Munoz and I've spent the better part of the last 3 years really investigating the impact of the pandemic on our future generation and our future workforce talent, which I think is a topic we will all find really critical right now as we are seeing a lot of shortages across the country. So with that, we can jump right in. So as I mentioned, my name is Cassie. I am what I call a non-traditional educator. I am also sort of a collector of cultures and experiences, if you will. I've always had a fascination with the human condition, kind of what makes us tick. And my formal educational background was really rooted in cultural theory, which is important for later on. After spending the first 9 to 10 years of my career really deeply immersed in international affairs, I made a pretty big career pivot about 6 months before the pandemic hit into K-12 educational outreach. And that was a really interesting time, not having had a crystal ball at that moment. Who could have foreseen the way the world would shift just a few months after I stepped into this role? And I was trying to really, in a new spot, trying to figure out what was going on in the world and how we could best respond with our programming to help students and families. So I'll share a little bit more about what that actually looked like in practice. But first, I wanted to put a question out to everyone here. I'm going to take you back in a time capsule. So come back with me a little bit to your childhood and think for a second about if someone were to ask you, what is the essence of childhood? What are the things that you remember? What was the best part about being a kid? By the way, throughout this presentation, I do use the term kid very endearingly. It's not meant to be condescending in any way, shape, or form. But what made childhood special to you? Maybe for some of you, it was riding your bike wherever you wanted to go, having that freedom. Maybe it was, not having to come home until the streetlights came on, spending time with friends and family, not really having any pressures outside of homework, maybe, go to school, come home, indulge in snacks, binge on some TV shows, just be goofy like the kids in this video here. A lot of times when I ask people this question, they think about their time spent exploring. They think about sports and activities that they were a part of and, big memorable moments like homecoming dances and football games, theater shows, etc. So consider for a minute here that during the pandemic, pretty much none of those things were available to kids. And so all of the things that the majority of us on this call probably would refer to as our quintessential childhood core moments really didn't happen for kids for a significant period of time during a really key developmental time as well. So on that note, when you think about previous generations, maybe you identify somewhere on this grid here. I know I can hold up my hands on the little millennial quadrant down there. Every generation has had moments that have defined it. Baby boomers, you might remember the JFK, Martin Luther King assassinations, the impact of landing on the moon, and what that meant to you for opening up a world of possibility of science that you didn't know existed. Gen X, the Challenger disaster, the Gulf War, so many political scandals and crises, the advent of cell phones that were too large to put in your pocket for a long time there. Millennials, I think each millennial will know exactly where we were on the moment we found out about September 11th, when it was happening. Also, we really experienced school shootings, the first ones, Columbine, the iPod, the iPad, when those kind of came into being. And Gen Z, our newest members here, Gen Z can't recall a single moment when the US was not at war with someone. Gen Z saw same-sex marriage not being legal, the Great Recession, Obama's re-election, Black Lives Matter. And so all of these societal events are important because they are shared. And it is the shared events that actually help us define a generation. The same events are what give us certain characteristics. So, all those events that boomers experienced tended to create a very optimistic, passionate, value-driven generation where respect and hierarchy were very important, remain important. Gen X, the latchkey kids, as we, sometimes hear them called, very independent, very efficient. Millennials, deep work-life integration, not a lot of boundaries, strong need for a mission with millennials. And Gen Z, very resilient, very resourceful, but also quite realist. So these things do impact us. It is fun to put them together sort of in a collage here. So take a minute to enjoy this curation of the internet, really kind of bringing light to some of these generational differences. It's like I was talking to, my daughter, and she was like, "Mom, why do we say that we hang up the phone, but where do you hang it? You just press a button, right?" Some of these terms just get passed down, same way that, I read a tweet once about a child who thought that the save icon in Microsoft Word was a 3D print of a floppy disk. They had no idea what an actual floppy disk was. So thinking about how our generations are defined by these things, then again, we go back to what has happened over the last 3 years, particularly 2020, 2021, into 2022. And you have to realize that the pandemic couldn't simply have this generationally defining moment and not really create any sort of distinction of its impact on our lives. I think this has also been really embodied in the internet. The pandemic memes really was the humor that got a lot of us through some pretty dark months. But this one really stuck out to me. How many of us, tried baking or tried, gardening or other tasks during the pandemic that we had never thought we'd have an interest in before? It just goes to show what a deep impact it did have. And so my work that I'm going to share today is about how the pandemic actually spurned a new generation. So previously the research said that Gen Z is still the defining terminology for the youth that are currently growing up now. The work that I've done actually shows that it's not. The pandemic prematurely ended what we call Gen Z and actually created a new generation that I'm calling Gen Zoom. And Gen Zoom, per my definition, was really anyone who was about 15 years old or younger in March 2020. There's a really specific reason for that we'll get into in a little bit. So where did this come from? So in my day job, I work at Michigan Technological University, and one of the key functions of my role is overseeing our Center for Educational Outreach. In this role, we run summer youth programs, which are residential overnight camps that have been running for well over 50 years. The only time they had ever been canceled was 2020. And our summer youth programs are quite diverse. Pre-pandemic, we saw about 1,100 participants a summer from 30 states, 14 countries. So wide geographic representation, as well as diversity in representation in terms of ethnic background and culture as well, and socioeconomic background. So 2020 we canceled just like everybody else. In 2021, we resumed. We were one of the first overnight residential programs to resume, and that was a really difficult decision at the time for a lot of reasons. We saw about 900, a little over 900 students that summer, and you can kind of see the breakdown here of some of their key sort of demographics. We realized very quickly, within 48, 72 hours, that the students who we were working with in that moment were dramatically different than students we had served in all of the summers preceding. We had just unimaginable behavioral issues, mental health issues, social issues. We were having a really difficult time with both our participants and our staff. And we sort of realized that something bigger was going on. And so I started, just for my own sanity, really, I created a Google Doc and just started documenting things that were happening each day. By about day 3, I had 3 or 4 pages of bullets written about circumstances and situations that we had never experienced before. And I took that and turned it into a really official Google form at that time. And I sent it out to other camp providers and after-school program providers in a network that we had across the country. And I basically just wanted to know if what we were seeing was unique. And what was very interesting was that the responses were overwhelmingly in agreement with the trends that we were seeing. Keep in mind, our reach is, quite international. That summer we had less international participation, obviously, because of visas and some other things that were happening. But the participants we had still came overwhelmingly from across the United States. So 91% of the colleagues that responded to my Google form agreed that youth between the ages of 6 and 15 at that time were the most significantly impacted. And, really putting this all into perspective, I sort of embarked on what has become about a 2.5-year journey of furthering that data and tracking that data to see how it's changed over time. When we think back to the pandemic, I know we don't really always want to go there. A lot of us have blacked a lot of that out in our minds. But it was really a total societal shift, right? So for youth in particular, again, between 6 and 15, what we mainly saw was a complete absence of spontaneous, uncontrolled interactions. So think about when you are, 6 to 15, think about middle school in particular, 13, 14, 15. There is a lot going on without a pandemic. You're going through friendship changes, puberty, physical, mental changes. You're starting to establish that independence from your parents and guardians and try to figure out really who you are. Now imagine that you have no public window in which to do that. So suddenly, instead of going to school, your school is on Zoom or whatever other virtual platform. The only mechanism of control you really have in your life at that point in time is whether or not your camera is on or your mic is on. Everything else is pretty much not within your control. And a lot of this is because us adults at that time, we had really great intentions. if you're like me in any case, I tried to shield my daughters in the beginning of what was happening, because remember, the beginning, it was just 2 weeks, and then just 4 weeks, and then just 6 weeks. And it just kept extending, but none of us knew that at that time. So I think a lot of parents shifted to this sort of protection mode where we felt we could just isolate our kids from what was happening. We didn't share a lot of information, and the information we did share, we didn't really know about either. Science was telling us, stay 12 feet apart, 6 feet apart, 18 feet. You have to use double masks unless they're made out of X material, right? So the information that we had and we were providing to our kids was really fluid. Also, for kids themselves, this is a time when they're already sort of testing that authority. So for our youth, they were experiencing a world in which their only window was via camera. So the act of having a camera on was a lot more than just having a camera on. It was telling the world, I am ready to be seen. When you were unmuted because you wanted to share something in a class, it wasn't just, I am unmuting myself so I can talk. It was, I'm unmuting myself because I have fully formed thoughts that I'm ready to share. Whereas many of us grew up in a school setting where, it didn't matter if I was having a bad hair day or couldn't figure out my outfit, which was often the case at 13, 14. I would go to school and be seen that way. And I had to learn to live with that discomfort, that normal teenage discomfort. In class, you could just get called upon, whether or not you actually were paying attention or you were passing notes or you knew what even was going on. And on top of that, as their only filter was this window, was a filter, they could create their appearance to be whatever they wanted it to be. Their name was whatever they typed it to be on Zoom. So again, this complete loss of control and exposure to uncontrolled daily events. When you are totally accustomed to your identity revolving around this set of controls like that, the natural response, I think, for most is that situations that don't allow you to have that create anxiety, which there's so much research now about how the pandemic has really exacerbated mental health crises. We know that as a society, but this is really why. Also, look at all the other things that happened at that time. We had masking, which, really prevented the ability to pick up verbal communication. Nonverbal communication was also challenged. Events were canceled left and right. And these were events like, those same things that you and I may remember were our pivotal points of childhood, homecoming or prom or graduation or whatever. Suddenly, they meant nothing. They were just so easily discarded. How do you tell a student, like, this is a pivotal American experience, and then it's just easily tossed off the calendar? There's also a lot of research now coming out about what's sort of being termed screen eye. So, our brains are physiologically wired to perceive threats, right? And when a face is actually in larger than normal proportion, such as on a screen, if you have a large screen like I do, our brains actually are pre-wired to interpret that as a threat. It expects a human face to be in certain proportions. So even when they're, mostly engaging by screen, depending on what screen they're using, just that act could subconsciously affect that communication platform and how they interpret it. And, finally, youth have very little public-facing social media. Unlike generations before them with things like Twitter and Facebook, most of their engagement is entirely closed circuit. So their information sources were quite limited and quite bubbleized, if you will. So as I mentioned, I've been tracking this for the last couple of years, and I've done a variety of different polls and snaps and surveys with students and all in different geographic areas and contexts during this time. When I ask students, what do you think of the future? Or when you think of the future, what do you feel? Many people were surprised that the vast majority of students would respond totally neutral. I actually am not surprised based on the research I've been doing. This is the thing that concerns me the most, by and large. This generation has such a strong apathy towards everything. And you can sort of guess why after we've just considered all of those factors they encountered during the pandemic. The constant change, I mean, anyone would become numb, right? Now, it's not to say that the older students, those who are over 15 in March, weren't impacted. They just had a little bit more ability to intake information. They had a little bit more of an ability to be more mobile, to intake information that led them to actually create decisions. We removed so much decision-making power from the younger students and the younger youth. And as a response, they really don't care about much of anything. How do you impact a generation if their baseline is that they just don't care? This is what I think we should all be concerned about. Of course, you expect them to be concerned about some other issues. You can see here, though, that the overwhelming response was, I don't know. When you ask them what problems we should be concerned about, I don't know. This is a response of, the world is so messed up, how do you expect me to know? When I asked some of the biggest ways the pandemic affected them, quite clear here, predominantly social. You don't see really a single response. And this is, I consolidated these, by the way, from a couple hundred students. I just themed these out, but by and large, you don't see a single academic impact here. It's all social. A few months ago, we also did a really large survey of several hundred local students in 10th and 11th grade. And you see how these actually play out in conversation. So when we asked them to tell us about their high school experience so far, most of this is quite pessimistic. I'm just here to get a diploma. A lot more disastrous than I thought. I don't expect to get anything out of high school. I just want to get done. This is burnout. This is a generation of burnout right here. It does get a little better when we asked the 10th graders the same question. We saw a little bit more optimism or reasons to be optimistic, but what is so interesting to me is that they have these very heavy contrasting thoughts. This last quote here, I'm having fun sometimes. I hope I'll just keep my will to live. I don't have much higher hopes than that. But also good grades and a good SAT score. If you don't work with youth every day, this sentence, you wouldn't know if you should panic and call someone, for help, or if if it's a joke, you wouldn't know. But this is like their baseline attitude. They have no distinction sometimes between the severity of certain statements and words. When we ask students what concerns you about the future, we do see some interesting consistencies. On here, I believe you see 6.7%, both 10th and 11th graders were most concerned about taxes, which was quite surprising to us at this time. The 10th graders were a little bit more concerned about college. Very few, comparatively, 11th graders were concerned about college. And that is actually a big concern. And you see in here, family concerns are quite consistent as well. When we asked them what fields might interest you after high school, we see here how some of those also change. By the time they get to 11th grade, it seems like they're being a bit more serious. They're interested in business, in the trades especially, but pretty standard for what we see across generations. But the hypothesis, based on all of this and my background in cultural understanding, really impacted me to apply these observations to a larger root behavioral context. And the hypothesis that came out of my work was really that the pandemic was a shared experience that created a brand new generation, which again is Gen Zoom. So let's take a look. So if you are a cultural theorist, which my guess is most people on this call are not, there's a really a famous researcher, theoretician who's named Geert Hofstede. He created these 6 dimensions of culture. Now his framework was really designed to apply to different countries. Okay, there's a QR code on the screen if you are so fascinated you want to look up more. But Geert said culture is the software of our minds. We need shared software in order to communicate. And he really came up with 6 dimensions on his framework that define every single country. So every country falls somewhere on one of 6 spectrums, or on each of 6 spectrums. He talks about how we make decisions, the way we interact with other people in a hierarchy, the extent to which we have prescribed gender roles, our ability to tolerate ambiguity, how we look at time as a concept, and how much we indulge or restrain our in gratification. So again, thinking about all of the observations that I had, it became really obvious to me that they all fit into a very similar framework. So I took Hofstede's framework and instead of making it about national culture, I actually shifted it towards generational culture. And I identified about 9 unique traits for Gen Zoom that I'd like to share with you. First is lower individualism. So during the pandemic, we were all living in bubbles. You remember your bubble people, the people that you were all going to be exposed to. If one person got exposed, you'd all be exposed. So, compared to the past, youth began to place very high value on collectivist decision making, which basically means consulting people around them before making basic decisions. So previously, we would expect a 10th, 11th, 12th grader to say, yeah, I want to study business because I'm really interested in entrepreneurialism. I want to own my own company. Now it's like, I want to study business because I talked to my dad and my aunt, and then my aunt's brother, who's blah, 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 which I guess would be his uncle. In any case, I've talked to these other people, and that's how I arrived at this decision. We see that as a result of the pandemic. They're very socially conscious. Also, those bubble people are the only individuals that they feel that they can be vulnerable with, which is really important and really different from previous generations. Especially because American culture as a whole is known to be very individualist, and that has shifted a lot with this generation. Low power distance. So from our experience, youth feel very entitled to confront others, irrespective of any title or role differences. So for example, when, if you are the president of a company and you have an entry-level employee, most of the time pre-pandemic, it would be somewhat expected that there would be an automatic differential there of respect that should be shown. This generation completely threw that out the window. By living exclusively on the internet and through Zoom for, the better part of 2 years, they didn't really ever learn how to interpret some of those walls. I mean, they had unlimited access, exclusive access to information online. And so they feel that they are quite self-empowered. Which is not a bad thing, but it is quite different from what we are accustomed to, and it can come across as abrasive. Low uncertainty tolerance. So again, when your whole life is sort of pre-scheduled and on Zoom, and you don't, have to necessarily worry about, you are very in control of your image all the time because it's only on when your camera's on. When you are not in those settings, it can be very difficult. So a lot of teachers during the pandemic, because they were also in survival mode, right? And also trying to manage their families and all of their other things of their lives, would send, the entire week's agenda maybe on Sunday or Monday, and then students would work fairly independently the rest of the week. This created a very interesting dynamic in which youth have become quite accustomed to having a pre-specified agenda far in advance. That was a very immediate issue that we had when we resumed our programming. Sunday, students were checking into our program saying, what's for dinner every single night of the week? Also, exactly at what time am I going to get to go and do this thing? So many questions that were completely, in our opinion, irrelevant and not critical. They felt it was absolutely critical to know. Future orientation. Youth are much more long-term oriented. They're willing to experience present discomfort for the future, which is a bit of a difference from the past. But consider that the things that were hallmarks or, cultural guarantees for them were suddenly not. Like taking the SAT, that just got canceled, and now everyone is test optional. Lack of important events. They also observed that, there was a lot of disagreement in public health about the approach to keeping society safe, preventing spread of disease, etc. They saw that people would, flaunt different regulations and rules that were put in place in COVID, and also that those rules changed all the time. They lost pretty much all trust and faith in the adults and in decision-making bodies. They also saw the George Floyd movement. They saw social justice, and they saw that from a very close lens on the internet, which was, a primarily a social media driven movement, right? And they were at the forefront of that. Indulgence. There was definitely a movement towards slow gratification. What is very interesting, I think one of the things people are most surprised about when I share about Gen Zoom is that they are the least tech savvy generation we have experienced in decades. And people think, oh, but they're young. They must, they grew up on this. Exactly. They grew up on technology. In my day, as a millennial, if I wanted little hearts to drop from the top of my computer screen when someone went to my MySpace page, I had to code that myself. I had to figure out HTML and I had to make it happen. Same with the internet. Learned how to wire networks, right? This generation, everything has been designed with user interface in mind. Everything was designed for them to swipe or to tap. So they never really learned the fundamental skills of resetting a router and unplugging it when the internet doesn't work, or troubleshooting how to get from Wi-Fi to a browser to enable your ability to join a network. They just don't have those because we made it too easy for them to not have to learn. And then by far the largest change that we saw was within how youth perceive gender identity, and what an important thing that was. We went from, over the course of about 50 years of running our summer programs, having one student in all that time that was, in that time we called it transgender, right? The summer we resumed operations, so 2021, we had over 40 in one summer. To go from 1 to 40 was huge. And in the end, when you think about it, when your entire identity is limited to who you are on a screen, and your name is what you type it, and your avatar is how you design it, and you don't have to be camera on, and you're not going into a school each day having to choose a bathroom with a sign on the wall, right? Where do kids experiment with expression? Where do they experiment with identity? For Gen Zoom, the only way that they really felt they had control over that was within their gender. So suddenly we had all of these students coming to us saying, I don't know if I want to be called he or she, maybe just call me they, or actually I want you to change my name to Matt. I'd prefer to be Matt. And it wasn't necessarily that we suddenly had more transgender participants, to use that word. It was just that gender was much more fluid with this generation, and they were simply wanting to explore with something because they hadn't had the ability to explore their identity or expression for 2 years. So many of them are flirting with change, as one of our colleagues had phrased it. The problem is actually with us that even when we have good intentions and we're trying to be inclusive, we're like, oh, so okay, you prefer he, they pronouns. Okay, so are you, non-binary? And they're like, I don't know if I'm non-binary. I just want to be called this. Even when we try to be helpful, we label, and that has been a big challenge. And then, finally, emotional regulation. This shouldn't be a huge surprise. They're just overwhelmed socially, sensorially. They cannot discern the difference between feeling anxious and having anxiety. Good example of this is, we'll have students say, I can't do this thing because I have social anxiety. And I always am quick to say, oh, are you feeling nervous? Are you feeling anxious? Because sometimes, sometimes we do things too well as a society. We've really increased access to mental health care, but unfortunately in the process, we have created somewhat of a over-diagnosing of this generation. Good example is I had a young girl that I am familiar with who was in one of our programs, and her mom came to drop her off. And the mom, who we've known this family for a long time, and the mom said, well, I'm going to stay here because she has social anxiety. And this was in front of the child, and this was a young child. And so, there forward, that child is going to associate this normal feeling of nervousness with hearing her mom say that she had social anxiety and couldn't do it. Henceforth, anytime she felt nervous, she was going to say, well, I can't do this because I have social anxiety, right? So even when we mean well and have good intentions, sometimes we have disadvantaged our kids in this generation from really participating the way we hope. That said, over a quarter of our participants in 2022 had disclosed a prescription medication. Over 10% of that was for anxiety and depression. Another 10% was for ADHD. So the emotional self-esteem is incredibly low. They've had very few practical experiences to gain self-confidence. When we surveyed our about 600 local high school students, 40% said that they're experiencing moderate or severe anxiety. Another 24% said moderate or severe major depression. That's huge for this generation. And goes back to that empathy. High empathy for humanity. So, this generation has seen some stuff. They have been through a lot. What we hear all the time is that everyone has a therapist, but they have been overexposed and underapplied, right? So they had 2 years where they didn't have normal social interactions to practice some of these things. So, they see something happen on a reel, on TikTok, on wherever, and they can say, yeah, that thing that happened is wrong. We should rally around this person and we should speak out about this. But then they would come to our overnight camp programs, and they would be arguing about that with their roommate because they couldn't figure out how to tell their roommate that they didn't like the window open at night. So, basic conflicts, very low ability to resolve those. However, large societal issues, they will have a philosophical discussion with you for 3 hours on. One teacher that we spoke to said they have sad FOMO, fear of missing out, as a resting emotion, and that has been so true. One of the other quotes that was really impactful when we surveyed our colleagues was that they said everyone seems to have regressed. Kids who should have been a little more independent were more needy than ever. If you were 13 when the pandemic started, you're still 13 now. Keep in mind, this was about a little over a year later. We still see that. It's like everyone is about 2 years behind developmentally, socially, and otherwise. So with that, let's meet Gen Zoom. All right, there are so many other statistics I could throw in here, but the short answer is that this generation has experienced what we probably 20 years from now will call generational trauma. And keep in mind that there are many who have been disproportionately impacted. I don't go into depth in this presentation about that, but anyone who had any sort of diverse needs or was traditionally or historically marginalized suffered at even greater rates. So just keep that in mind. So Gen Zoom is defined by a pandemic, and I always use the Twinkie as sort of a metaphor for this. So, we like to think of Twinkies as being this great American thing, and they deep fry them in Minnesota, right, at the state fair and all of these things. So if you in your entire life have only heard people say how great Twinkies are and the inside is like soft and the filling is fluffy and blah, 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 you've heard people talk about Twinkies forever, but you have never actually had one, it means absolutely nothing. Not only that, but it precludes your ability to relate to that person who is talking to you and not seeing that it's resonating. We now need to work to resonate with this younger generation. If you were 15 or younger in 2020, you are either in college now or entering the workforce. So they are here, they are fully embedding into society, and we're not really prepared for them. So from a college perspective, we have seen significant declines in enrollment nationally. Gen Zoom is about 7 times less likely to attend college compared to 2019. We also saw completed applications for college go down. They dropped from 68% to about 54%. Those that did come to college, I work on a college campus. It's been a huge topic of discussion because they're not doing well in core classes. If you missed calculus or chemistry or biology in high school, and now you're trying to pursue a career that has heavy STEM reliance, you're going to be struggling. We've had to create a lot of bridge programs to help students become successful in topics and courses that they should have mastered in high school. Also, there is rampant information inaccuracy around college access. So go back to that bubble mentality. If your bubble is, your mom and your dad and, maybe an aunt, and you're a first generation college student in your family, adults mean well, but we didn't really give kids access to guidance counselors because they were so overwhelmed. Teachers were so overwhelmed, right? So the people that normally imparted advice about college were just not present for a couple of years there. A lot of schools are still struggling to bounce back with staffing shortages, so a lot of students are still suffering, especially in rural areas. So suddenly, the main information that you're getting is from a parent that is well-meaning, but maybe not super well educated themselves. And also, you're relying on that information more than historically you would have because of that collectivist sort of shift. And for faculty, one thing I always apologize for in this presentation, but students are not coming to college for knowledge. They are coming for networking. If they want to know how to do something, they go to YouTube. They want to know how to fix something, how to learn something, whatever it may be, they go to the internet. They're not coming to college to learn. They're coming to meet mentors, to meet faculty, and to meet other people to have similar life experiences, especially that they missed. As far as industry goes, be prepared. We have major shifts, cultural shifts coming to us in the workforce. This generation is going to demand company values to match actions. If you have fluffy mission statements that aren't actually in alignment with your day-to-day practices, they will call you out on that and they will not stay. They also, are very vocal about things that we probably, this generation is going to push us as a society in a lot of positive ways. They're going to push for things like mental health breaks, mental health care, menstruation leave, things like that. They have a very high need for transparency because, again, during the pandemic, they didn't receive that from the adults that they trusted in their lives for whatever reason, either because we didn't give it to them on purpose or because what we gave them shifted, even we didn't know it either. Regardless, the outcome is that they are much more motivated by consensus-driven organizational structure. So if you have a very top-down company culture with silos, you're going to have a difficult time attracting and retaining talent. And communication, this generation is already starting to make headlines for the way they communicate in their sign-offs and emails. They have very strong work-life boundaries. When they are off, and you better not call or text or expect any kind of response. They have a very strong preference for informal communication as opposed to email. And I think that most companies find it quite jarring. But in many ways, we've seen the Great Resignation, we've seen quiet quitting. Now we're looking towards this new term called coffee badging, where they just come in, get their free coffee, and then go to work from home. This generation is totally going to shape the workforce over the next 5 to 10 years. It's really on us if we are going to create an environment that enables that, because like it or not, this is the up and coming generation, and they will be our leaders here. So some strategies for connection. So, this generation really struggles with knowing what healthy boundaries are. So they mistake a cordial relationship sometimes for an overly personal relationship. So I always let people know you should be a flight attendant. Say, hey, my name is Cassie. My role is to help guide you through college and connect you with resources and support. But I'm not your therapist. I'm not really the best person for you to talk about X problem with or whatever. Highlight inclusive things in affinity spaces, especially within your companies or organizations. If there are things that you are very proud of that have made your workplace more welcoming or have a deeper sense of belonging, make sure that is front and center in all of your recruitment. It's visible from your website, your social media, everything, because otherwise they will not be drawn to work for you. And then be upfront about policies, processes, expectations. And I mean upfront and very basic. This means like every day, we expect you to wear XYZ. Your lunch hour will consist of this amount of minutes. This is how, we expect. These are things that we assume they know, but this generation doesn't know. They don't have that instinctual piece that has carried over from the past because they just missed a few years of practice. And when you have conflict, my biggest piece of advice is to start with, okay, can you tell me more? Just seek information, because oftentimes they start with one problem and then actually the problem is totally different. And this is true. This is a leadership tip regardless of the generation, but this generation in particular has not had a lot of practice with emotional regulation. And so sometimes they lead, with something that is actually not the real issue. And you'll say a lot of time if you just say, okay, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, until you get to the heart of it. The real work starts with us. The same storm, sort of different ship analogy really fits here. We all experienced the pandemic. We were all impacted. We were all affected in some way. But the reality is that this generation just experienced it differently because they were younger and they relied on adults to navigate it for them. And we really let them down. So you are not starting with trust. And also there aren't any comps to this experience. Like it goes over really poorly when you say, yeah, well, in my, day, we had the Vietnam War, or we did bomb drills under our desks or whatever. All of that may be true. But if we're seeking to create a connection, you're not going to do that if you are trying to fight for, validating trauma. And also, every element of their lives was uprooted for the better part of 2 years. Not just, one element of it. Finally, keep it in context. Kids are still kids. So regardless of a pandemic, regardless of all of these things that we've discussed, kids still think that they are invincible. They know better than you. They know more than you. We see that. We still see the same silliness and playfulness. They still seek to have the same experiences out of life. But it's really on us if we want to, best work with and engage this generation, this new workforce that is coming up and coming in, then we need to be able to empathize with the experiences that they've had so that we can create connections and we can actually create productive relationships. With that, I'd be happy to have some discussion and answer any questions and talk a little bit more about your thoughts on this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. Very valuable information. Look forward. We've got a lot of questions. Obviously, as you said, this next generation, Gen Zoom, as you've crafted it, is our next generation workforce. And we do appreciate you sharing some of the strategies for those connections that are really important. So as you said, one of those strategies. Okay, can you tell me more, Cassie? And I'm going to start with some of the questions that the audience have added to the chat. So let's get started. So the first question, with your various survey questions, were you able to characterize your respondents along some dimensions which might give you clues for some of those examples, urban versus rural, income, family education, number of siblings, for example?
Yeah, initially when the first survey went out to different youth program providers across the country, it was very basic. At that time, these are the things that are happening. Is anyone seeing them? A lot of the people, so the respondents from that were program providers from all over the country, but understandably, the youth that were in their programs were also from all over the country. So it was really difficult to capture in that initial survey some of that data. Subsequently, over the last 2.5, 3 years, I presented in different circles and captured data in different circles. For example, a lot of those slides that we saw with the snapshot responses was actually from a conference for youth of color. The majority of them are first generation. Many of them are also low income. Some of the other survey results was from a different population of rural youth, also majority low income. So the data's kind of come from everywhere. As far as of this presentation, the next step is I'm seeking a partner who has a connection to a widespread demographic, whether that's like districts or something similar, to actually conduct a formal survey and get more formal responses. This presentation was really just an encapsulation of a lot of those more anecdotal pieces.
Thank you for that. So there's more work to be done.
Yes.
And I think it will take a community to do this. And so we appreciate you sharing this, and some of the folks on the line, could be a part of this so we can continue to kind of serve and make sure that we support, as you said, this next generation. So
yeah, and if I can just add one more thing, Christine, too,
sure.
Really important about this is that it's iterative, right? Like so much of the data is emergent. Even this morning, I was reading a really fascinating article about the importance of free play in a child's life, and how actually that may be the largest driver of some of the mental health crises we're seeing. And so my work on GenZoom has really been to put together a silhouette, right? So rather than just a news headline or an article that you might see come across of, the impact on learning or the impact of test scores or whatever, my goal has been to focus on sort of the cultural silhouette. And silhouettes, by definition, are dark in the middle, right? So the role that we have now is to start coloring that in and filling that in with some of those other experiences. And that's where this iterative piece comes back together. So I would really very much love to connect with others who might be interested in coming along with me on this journey, or supporting or collaborating in any way. But I'm really grateful to listen to my work on GenZoom.
Excellent. So somebody asked if the slides will be shared. Yes, the slides will be shared. You'll get a survey after this, and the video also will be shared. So if there's other colleagues that anybody wants to share the webinar with, but that will happen as well. We're going to head to one more question. We got a few minutes left. Cassie, what strategies does Cassie employ to ensure the feedback obtained from the youth is genuine and not hollow? I think you probably answered a bit of that with the earlier question, but I'll let you expound on that or expand on that thing.
Yeah, so actually the trick is getting feedback at all. Really, honestly, when I get them to contribute anything, I'm not as much concerned about how genuine it is. Usually I'm trying to get them to expound on it a little bit more, to get something more meaningful than just, I don't know, or it sucks, or, something like that. I think that for most of them, their baseline is apathy, and unfortunately, that's the most concerning thing for me about this generation. And by the way, there are so many reasons to be optimistic. There are many positive things that I'm happy to talk more about in other contexts from this work and this data. But by and large, when you first start to engage with them about some of these experiences, the challenge is actually just getting them to open up. They are not shy. They're very happy to engage frankly about some of those experiences, and they don't really have in the game of not being genuine. The harder part is that since we're not starting from a place of trust with them, the hardest part is actually just getting them to open up to be able to have a dialogue that we can learn from.
Appreciate that. We have 1 minute left to come to our conclusion. Any closing remarks, calls to action? You sort of mentioned that you'd like other collaborators to come along, but I'll let you say the final word before we conclude, Cassie.
Sure. I'm sorry, Christine, you cut out there for a second. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. I just said we have 1 minute left. I'm not sure if you have a call to action, closing remarks, so we can continue to, work together and grow to make sure that this next generation of workforce is highly functioning in whatever they need to be doing. So take it away.
Yeah. So this presentation is really a shortened version of a longer training that I offer. So I'm happy to work with individual companies or organizations if you're interested in having sort of a deeper training. Usually I ask for about 90 minutes or so, and there's an interactive component to that where we sort of work hand in hand with some of the challenges your organization is facing and how they might anticipate needing to address those with this generation. For me, the call to action here is really that everyone understands that there's an empathy piece that needs to come first, but B, there's really a call for a culture shift. And so I have versions of this presentation and versions of this work that has been designed to give the workforce a more specific and direct set of strategies, as well as for higher education. And I've also done some for more community development. So the short answer is this is a condensed version of a longer training that I'm really happy to work individually with organizations or others on. Please just feel free to reach out, and I'd be happy to talk more.
I appreciate that, Cassie. So we're 2:01, everybody. Again, thank you for joining us. Appreciate the interaction, the very good questions. It is December 14th. I'm going to say happy holidays because it's rolling right around. So thanks everybody for joining us. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.